The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday, its edges damp and smudged, as if it had traveled through time itself to reach her, and maybe it had. Evelyn Harper hadn't thought about Daniel in years. Not since the summer they were 17, when he'd promised to love her forever and then vanished without a trace. She'd moved on, built a life for herself, and buried the memories of that summer deep in the back of her mind. But the letter changed everything. It was from Daniel. After 20 years of silence, his handwriting was unmistakable. The letter was short, just a few lines. Evelyn, I need your help. Come to Willowbrook, please. Daniel. Willowbrook. The small coastal town where they'd grown up, where they'd fallen in love, and where he'd broken her heart. Evelyn hadn't been back since the day he left, but something in his words tugged at her. Against her better judgment, she packed a bag and drove to Willowbrook. The town was exactly as she remembered it, quaint, quiet, and frozen in time. The old lighthouse still stood on the cliff, its beam cutting through the fog. The diner where they'd shared milkshakes was still there, though the sign was faded and the paint was peeling. And the house where Daniel had lived with his grandmother was still standing, though it looked abandoned. Evelyn checked into a small inn and spent the first day wandering the town, trying to piece together what had happened to Daniel. She asked around, but no one had seen him in years. The only clue she found was an old photograph tucked inside a book at the local library. It was of her and Daniel, standing in front of the lighthouse, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. But in the background, barely visible, was a figure, a man, watching them from the shadows. That night, Evelyn went to the lighthouse. She didn't know why, but something drew her there. As she climbed the stairs, she found a box tucked away in a corner. Inside were more photographs, letters, and a journal. The journal was Daniel's, and as she read it, the truth began to unravel. Daniel hadn't left her by choice. He'd been forced to leave. The man in the photograph was his father, a man Daniel had never known. His father had been involved in something dangerous, something that had put Daniel's life at risk. To protect Evelyn, Daniel had left without a word, disappearing into the night. Evelyn tracked Daniel down to an old cabin in the woods. He looked older, worn down by years of running, but his eyes were the same, soft, kind, and filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to leave you. But I couldn't risk your life." Evelyn didn't know whether to hug him or hit him. Instead, she asked the question that had haunted her for 20 years, why now? Why reach out after all this time? Daniel hesitated, then handed her a file. Inside were documents, photographs, and a map. His father was planning something big, something that could destroy Willowbrook. And Daniel needed Evelyn's help to stop him. Together, they uncovered the truth. Daniel's father was involved in a smuggling ring, using the old lighthouse as a drop point. He'd been blackmailing Daniel for years, threatening to hurt Evelyn if he didn't cooperate. But now, Daniel had had enough. With Evelyn's help, they gathered evidence and went to the police. The operation was shut down, and Daniel's father was arrested. But the victory came at a cost. Daniel was injured in the final confrontation, and as he lay in the hospital, Evelyn realized something: she still loved him. A year later, Evelyn stood on the cliff overlooking the ocean, the lighthouse behind her. Daniel stood beside her, his hand in hers. They'd rebuilt their lives together, turning the pain of the past into a promise for the future. "Do you remember the promise we made?" Daniel asked, his voice soft. Evelyn smiled. "To love each other forever." Daniel nodded. "I never forgot." And as the sun set over Willowbrook, Evelyn knew that some promises were worth keeping.